Hello and welcome. This is Jim Karp, and we're going to talk about setting yourself up successfully to work remotely. I've got Jennifer, Mark, and Jessica. Folks, introduce yourselves, and then we'll get down to business.
Thanks, Jim. This is Jennifer Poplava, and I'm an attorney at Mika Meyers.
Thanks, Jim. Mark Spock here, Director of Security and Support Services for Rehmann Technology Solutions.
Hi, Jim. Jessica Dory, Principal in charge of the Technology Risk Management Group at Rehmann.
All right. So last time we had a chance to talk, we talked about the technical as well as administrative controls to make sure that you're safe at working in a remote environment. Today, it may not be as exciting, but it's just as important. And what we have to do is make sure that we talk about the policies and procedures and all of the infrastructure behind the scenes that needs to be done, as well as making sure it's communicated. So Jennifer, a lot of times there's confusion between what a policy is, what a procedure is. Can you shed some light on that for us?
Sure thing. Policies and procedures, both very important. Sometimes people conflate them into being the same thing, but they're really not. A policy is more a broad tenet of an organization. So it's a general idea or a company's commitment to move in a certain direction or achieve certain goals. Procedures, on the other hand, are more step-by-step instructions as to how to act in a way that is consistent with the policy. So you don't want to put together your procedures until you know what your policy is. And then once you have your policy in place, then you can implement procedures that help your employees understand what they need to do. It's important to do both, and it's important to give thought to both. I have encountered many clients during my years of practice who think that they can just adopt someone else's policy as their own, and they put that into writing and just change the names. And that's actually very dangerous, because if you aren't really doing what you're saying you're doing in your policy, then you can get in a lot of trouble. There are laws saying that you need to actually do what you say and say what you do. So it's important to actually do this mindfully. So my advice to clients when they're first embarking in, let's say, policies related to working remotely, is to put together a team to sit down and decide, well, what is your policy? Are you allowing people to work remotely? If you are, then talk about how that might look. And after you have that conversation, then it is time to start writing things down and mapping out how your employees can actually function given your end goal. As I mentioned in the previous podcast, a very important part of the background work that needs to happen before you start developing your policy or your procedures is to understand your assets, your intellectual assets, your data assets, your technical assets, because the steps that you might want to take to protect your information might be more stringent if you're dealing with very sensitive information like social security numbers or financial information, as opposed to if you have public information that anybody can really see and it's not that big of a deal. So it's important to have that understanding as you embark upon that process. And then another thing that's very important after you conclude the process of developing your policies and your procedures, you need to put in place a system for reviewing on a periodic basis to make sure that things don't need tweaking. Because again, if you have a policy that doesn't reflect your reality, then things need to be changed. Either your practices need to change or your policy needs to change. And that does happen. I'm sure that there are plenty of businesses that never dreamed that they would mobilize their entire workforce to work remotely. And so they may have prohibited their employees from doing so. And certainly that is something that had to change when the pandemic hit and everybody started staying home. It's important to formalize those changes so that you can give clear direction to employees about how they're expected to do their work. So a big important part of enacting that is, implementing the technical controls that protect the process that you then use. So I'll turn to Mark to give us a little bit more information about the technical controls that would then follow from the procedures that you develop.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you, Jennifer. That's a great lead in. And that's really the important point is, we want to be very careful that, we don't have the tail wagging the dog, and it's really the policy that really needs to be the driver here. And really, as an organization, you really want to focus on establishing those policies and the procedure, because then that's really going to dictate the control that you need to put in place. And this is something that can really help many IT departments, you know, in that battle to try to get good technologies in place, get protective measures in place. Sometimes it's very difficult to put that value proposition together. But if we're working together at the policy layer and understanding how we need to secure the business and what we're securing, it makes those conversations much easier, because now we're making decisions at the policy layer, and that begins to drive the control investments that and the changes that we need to make. I'll just give an example for, you know, many organizations that are in the regulated space. You know, oftentimes many of them will have, for example, a personal email restriction in place. So if you are working at the company, you are not able to access your personal email account, such as a Gmail account or Hotmail. And this is really just to protect client sensitive information. We want to make sure that there's no data that's leaving the organization. We want to protect those sensitive data types. So now you want to make sure that you have a web content filtering policy and an email filtering policy that's in place to make sure that we don't have those sensitive data types that are leaving the organization. And then also, when we talk about remote work, well, does that policy travel with you? Maybe that policy applied when that laptop or that desktop was in the four walls of your business. But what about now that that endpoint is working remote? Does the same policy apply? Are we still adhering to that policy, and do we have the right control? Well, maybe at that point, we now have to shift and we have to make an investment potentially into an agent approach that makes sure that that endpoint is adhering to that policy. So that really kind of gets into, you know, what I like to touch on is really the compliance and audit side of it. And I'd love to hear what Jessica has to say here, because really this is an ongoing effort to make sure that the technical controls that we're putting in place are helping us adhere to the policy that we say of what we're going to do.
Absolutely. Thanks, Mark. Yeah, I mean, you hit on a great component there related to compliance and audit. So we put these policies and procedures in place, you know, to make sure that that employees do adhere to these, because we have these in place to govern, you know, what controls we have in place and how employees are supposed to be following those controls and adhering to these policies. You know, a big part of that really comes into, if you don't communicate this to your employees, you know, how are they going to know? And that really comes back to when we come full circle, when we talk about the audit. When you go into an organization to audit them, what you're really looking at is, are they following the policies and procedures that they have outlined in the organization? So it's very, very important to make sure that you are communicating these on a regular basis to your employees, that you have educational solutions and programs in place, you know, that are educating the employees about all of the policies and the procedures that the organization does have in place, and what their role is in adhering to those policies and procedures. Also, when you're, you know, talking with employees, always discuss those common threats that are out there, because it's so important that your employees are aware of what are those threats and what are those attacks that are happening out there, and what is their responsibility in protecting the organization from those threats.
Okay, so with a quick recap here, basically it is, you got to get a policy and procedure that's out there, and you have to say what you're going to do and then do what you say. And with that, you have to bring it to life with the making sure that your technical controls back up and support the policy that you got in place. And then third, and just as important, is if you never communicate it, nobody knows, and that's a risk as well. So education and training are real important. Folks, this is really good information. So we've talked in the past two podcasts, this one now from a procedural perspective, the first one working remotely. Let's come up with a third one here. We'll talk next in regards to incident response and what do you do in the event that you are working remote or you compromised at the office. So thanks for your time, and we'll talk to you next time.